Elixir School. Testing. Testing is an important part of developing software. In this lesson, we'll look at how to test our Elixir code with XUnit and some best practices for doing so. XUnit. Elixir's built-in test framework is XUnit, and it includes everything we need to thoroughly test our code. Before moving on, it is important to note that tests are implemented as Elixir scripts, so we need to use the .exs file extension. Before we can run our tests, we need to start XUnit with xunit.start. This is most commonly done in test/test helper. When we generated our example project in the previous lesson, Mix was helpful enough to create a sample test for us, or a simple test for us. We can find it at test example test. We can run our project's tests with mix test. If we do that now, we should see an output similar to 2 tests, 0 failures. Why are there 2 tests in the output? Let's look at lib example. Mix created another test for us, some doc test. Assert. If you've written tests before, then you're familiar with assert. And some frameworks should or expect fill the role of assert. We use the assert macro to test that the expression is true. In the event that it is not, an error will be raised and our test will fail. To test a failure, let's change our sample and then run mix test. Now we should see a different kind of output. Assertion with equals failed. Left, right. Stack trace. XUnit tells us exactly where our failed assertions are, what the expected value was, and what the actual value was. Refute. Refute is to assert as unless is to if. Use refute if you want to ensure a statement is always false. Assert raise. Sometimes it may be necessary to assert that an error has been raised. We can do this with assert raise. We'll see an example of assert raise in the next lesson on plug. Assert receive. In Elixir, applications consist of actors/processes that send messages to each other. Thus, often you want to test the messages being sent. Since XUnit runs in its own process, it can receive messages just like any other process, and you can assert on it with the assert received macro. Assert received does not wait for messages. Assert received does not wait for messages. With assert receive, you can specify a timeout. Capture IO and capture log. Capturing an application's output is possible with XUnit capture IO without changing the original application. Simply pass the function generating the output in. XUnit capture log is the equivalent for capturing output to logger. Test setup. In some instances, it may be necessary to perform setup before our tests. To accomplish this, we can use the setup and setup all macros. Setup will be run before each test, and setup all once before the suite. it is expected that they will return a tuple of OK state. The state will be available to our tests. For the sake of example, we'll change our code to use setup all. Mocking. The simple answer to mocking Elixir is don't. You may instinctively reach for mocks, but they are highly discouraged in the Elixir community, and for good reason. For longer discussion, there is this excellent article. The gist is that instead of mocking away dependencies for testing, mock as a verb, it has many advantages to explicitly define interfaces, behaviors for code outside your application, and using mock as a noun implementations in your client code for testing. To switch the implementations in your application code, the preferred way is to pass the module as arguments and use a default value. If it does not work, use the built-in configuration mechanism. For creating these mock implementations, you don't need a special mocking library, only behaviors and callbacks. I was trying to mock some AWS calls the other day. Update. Almost 2 years later, we have released a teeny library called mocks. Have you seen this? There were two of these libraries. This one was the Jose Valum. Oh, I should know how to pronounce that. Blessed by the creator. Mocks stubs do not remove the need to define an explicit interface between your components, modules, classes, whatever. The blame is not on mocks, though. They are actually a useful technique for testing. However, our test tools often make it very easy to abuse mocks, and the goal of this post is to provide better guidelines on using them. What are mocks? The Wikipedia definition is excellent. Mocks are simulated entities that mimic the behavior of real entities in controlled ways. I will emphasize this later but I always consider mock to be a noun, never a verb. Case study, external APIs. Let's see a common practical example, external APIs. Imagine you want to consume the Twitter API in your web application, and you are using something like Phoenix or Rails. At some point, a web request will come in, which will be dispatched to a controller, which will invoke the external API. Let's imagine this is happening directly from the controller. The code may work as expected, but when it comes to making the tests pass, a common practice is to just go ahead and mock as a verb, the underlying HTTP client used by my app Twitter client. You proceed to use the same technique in a couple other places, and your unit and integration tests pass. Time to move on? Not so fast. The whole problem with mocking the HTTP client is that you just coupled your application to that particular HTTP client. For example, if you decided to use a new and faster HTTP client, a good part of your integration test suite will now fail because it all depends on mocking HTTP client itself, even when the application behavior is the same. In other words, the mechanics changed, the behavior is the same, but your tests fail anyway. That's a bad sign. Furthermore, because mocks, like the one above, change modules globally, they are particularly aggravating in Elixir, as changing global values means you can no longer run that part of your test suite concurrently. The solution: instead of mocking the whole HTTP client, we could replace the Twitter client with something else during tests. Let's explore how the solution would look like in Elixir. The in-memory one avoids HTTP crusts altogether. Explicit contracts. This is what I've been doing. Assert received. That's what I've been missing. Alright, be right back.